Hey guys, Missing Pixel here. Welcome back to Davilex Overflow. I would like to thank everyone for all the nice comments from the last video. It was nice to see this series and these games be appreciated. In this part 2, we'll be looking at the 2002 to 2003 PS2 generation of games. On the 22nd of November 2001, Davilex had created a press release about a brand new game that they'd been working on. This was US Racer. The press release is a fascinating look in regards to learning more about Davilex's plans of the time. We can see that Davilex signed for the NetImmerse license all the way back in September 2000. It was an early name for the game by our engine. Strange that it took them so long to develop a game using this engine. Does that mean US Racer was in development for over a year? The Chief Technology Officer at Davilex stated that the flexibility of the engine will allow them to develop for the PC, PlayStation 2, Xbox and other platforms, to be announced. It is interesting that they bring up the Xbox, as none of the Racer games made it to that platform, although releases on the Xbox may have not even ever been planned, and Lambert was only referring to the flexibility of the engine. Here's what I would have said. However, the final paragraph of the release says that PS1, PS2, Xbox and online internet gaming will be a core of Davilex Games' company range. We know that this plan had changed, with no online gaming or Xbox games having been released, other than Miami Vice on Xbox. We can see that the game had been released on the 15th of November 2001 on PC and spring 2002 on PS1 and PS2, and this will explain something that I'll talk about later on. Something that you may have not noticed is that Davilex's PS2 discs and manuals all have the regional logos on them. Since you have to pay Sony to press the discs, and you have to press a minimum quantity, it would come out cheaper for Davilex to print one disc for the whole of Europe, or at least that's my theory. We can see that the game was published as USA Racer in Europe, US Racer in Germany, A2 Racer Goes USA in the Netherlands, and USA Racing in France. But have you ever seen the American release of US Racer? According to the press release, it was due to come out, and I have certainly seen quite a few American PC boxed copies on eBay, but I haven't been able to find an American PS2 version. According to PSX Data Center, no Davilex games had ever been released in America on Sony's platforms. Within the Infogrames press release, they were the ones who were supposed to handle the publishing of Davilex games in America, but their logo is not featured anywhere on the American PC US Racer boxes. And then, they talk about a US release of Miami Powerboat Racer, which did come out, in Europe at least. I can't find anything about an American release, but Patriot Racer? What is that? I thought it could be a different name for US Racer, like the whole M25 Racer and London Racer ordeal, but no, this was supposed to come out after US Racer. Presumably this was going to be a game developed by a different studio, like the boat games that had been developed by Lost Boys Games. As I'm not an American, I can only presume that this Infogrames deal fell through, but please, Americans, do let me know if 6 Davilex games had ever released in your region. There was a rebrand of US Racer released in America under the name of Police Chase, but otherwise it is an identical game, and was published by a different publisher entirely. All of the regional games are based on the US Racer framework. For example, the characters are all the same between these titles, just with different names, attributes and clothing. In fact, even the Yee-Haw menu music persists throughout all of these regional titles, and likewise the menu system itself stays the same. Although there's a large elephant in the room. Because the PS2 version of US Racer had not released until a few months after the PC version, it means that the PC version of US Racer is drastically different to the PS2 version and every subsequent PC release of Davilex games, featuring a completely different menu UI and game HUD, which was also seen on the PS1. In fact, even though the PS1 versions of Davilex games are outsourced to Inverse Entertainment, I wouldn't be surprised if the PC and PS1 versions were worked on by Davilex in tandem, as both versions have quirks and features that a PS2 version does not have. For example, the progress throughout the stage is determined by which character you pick. That means you can choose to switch to a different character at any point, not something that you can do on the PS2 without creating a different save file. The character names slightly change between the PC/PS1 and PS2, and all versions of the game have slightly different intros. Take a look.
Hey there, cowboy! Get your cattle car off the road!
Whoa, hold your horses there, fella!
Hey there, cowboy! Get your freaking cattle car off the road!
Whoa, hold your horses there, fella!
The PC and PS1 versions also give you the illusion of being able to pick which license to play, despite the fact you need to unlock each license one by one. Choosing the license was obviously removed in the PS2 version, since it's largely unnecessary. PS2 and PC games have different camera angles to pick from. The PC version has a lot of angles too, reminiscent of 90s Davilex games. In fact, there's a lot of quirks from Davilex's earlier games that don't make it into the later titles, such as the voice that hypes you up for each stage like in A2 Racer 4 and Vacantia Racer.
Yo, Yosemite! Alright, we're getting back to nature and doing the wild thing.
The characters all have voice dialogue too, both in the menus and in-game, and likewise so does the police. And when you win a license, the announcer says different things depending on the character you picked. Again, the licenses feel very 90s Davilex, and while they did persist in the PS2 version, even having a 3D model for each one, This mechanic later got changed into leagues for the regional games. The largest difference between the PC and PS2 is that the PS2 version gets a massive graphical overhaul, from the textures and 3D models to the lighting, which look absolutely stunning. These early Davilex 3D games focus way more on realistic lighting than the later titles, and it shows. What you may not be able to tell on video is that the handling model is completely different in the PC version. It's not the Davilex staple of automatic braking when entering corners. Here the cars are far more rigid when steering. That horrible motion blur when you hit a car or use the nitro isn't here either, and neither is the slow motion when you have a heavy hit. In terms of the little things in the PC version, the game files are not packed into a single image, which means that all of the assets are accessible. The game also runs at 60 FPS versus the 25 FPS of the other PC and PS2 games, which causes weird physics stutters on basically every system that I've played this game on, and the game is a little bit less stable in terms of potential crashes. Before we start digging through the game files, let me just talk about the music and gameplay. The US Race soundtrack is pretty faithful as to what it's trying to emulate. Because of the low sample rate, whether intentional or not, it gives off an AM radio vibe that is, or at least was, common in the US compared to over in Europe. The music, from what I'm able to tell, is unique to this game too, and isn't reused in the later titles, which makes sense, as they are mostly stereotypically American sounding, although LA's KLAP features a song called Celebrate the Love, which is very shortly featured in Autobahn Riser 4 as part of a commercial segment. And Washington's Wig station features the winner song that you hear in the games from 2003 onwards, in a longer version. For the first time, we have radio presenters, presenting things such as the weather, fictional news events, and having colours on the line. Another nice touch to the American radio are the 4-letter station IDs for each radio in the game. Although I believe that all stations have to start with a K or a W in America, so this game takes some creative liberties with the names. But still, what a really cool touch from Davilex. And yeah, there's a lot of musical variety in US Racer. And it would be nice if one day we got to hear these songs in CD quality. That's if anyone at Davilex has even kept them. Because of the way that the licenses are split, you first play the country tracks before the city ones, which is a nice touch for you not to get bored of playing the game after 15 minutes. Unlike the regional titles that will repeat the tracks in each league. The environment has dynamic elements like boulders falling onto the ground, which we do not see later on. Like the 90s titles, US Racer and the regional games feature money pickups used to upgrade your car, as well as to buy repair and nitro, since whatever nitro you have at the end of each stage carries on to the next one. You may not also know this, but the PS1 booklet for US Racer features a detailed description of each character in the game, which is not seen in the PS2 booklet. London Racer 2, which you'll see later in this video, does feature the character description in both booklets. The PS2 manual for US Racer also features the Windows 98 title bar. Oops. The PS1 also had a slightly different roster of cars. The effort to edit the cars and characters for the regional games hasn't been the highest. In terms of debug stuff, if we enable show dialogue, we can set a custom resolution for the game to render at, which means that you can run the game at 1080p or above without needing to use DG Voodoo, though the game will still run at 4x3 internally, and therefore it is stretched, and this applies to all Game Barrel games. Within US Racer, we have a show warning flag that generates this image. I can imagine that there was supposed to be text in front of this image, although in the debug log, it doesn't fail to load anything, so whatever this was, it got scrapped, and in the later games, this flag will crash the game. There are references to pedestrians, though there aren't any in-game. And within multiple files we can see aggression levels for each of the drivers and the cops, meaning that they all have different attributes, like the latter first generation Davilex games, where each character has different driving styles and desires, though you wouldn't really be able to tell in-game. We have some possibly scrapped cars? I don't think I've seen FBI cars, though they are mentioned a lot in the INI files. Let me know if I'm being silly. Though what is definitely not in the game are the different sizes of trucks and family cars, as there are no NIF files associated with them. Though something you may not have noticed is that the taxi cab has the early logo for US Racer, or at least a placeholder, since it's using artwork from Europe Racer with the same font type. Some INI files have early names for the characters. Well, more their attributes that were likely decided early on in the development before the names became finalized. USA Tweak Camera lets you move the camera with your mouse. F12, I believe, without changing any default flags, lets you take a screenshot. There's also the main star of the show, Debug Flag, which lets you unlock all tracks in the game, nice, but more importantly, it lets you do free cam, switch between viewing AI cars, switch to wireframe mode, freeze game logic, see how many polygons are on screen, and that's mainly it. There are some debug tracks mentioned, but because they have not been included in the game, we get a crash. Briefly jumping ahead to 2004, Karma Studios was commissioned to create a US Racer game for the GBA. There is almost nothing known about this game, other than some screenshots that can be seen on the archive of the studio's page. I have tried to get in contact with the founder of Karma Studios, Martin Wenting, who had started another studio called Revival Studios. Unfortunately, my inquiry was sent 2.5 years ago, and I have not received a response. And seeing that Revival Studios have not posted anything on their website or social media since 2018, I don't think I'll be receiving a response. I haven't been able to find anything on the internet from Martin recently, so I hope that he's doing okay. London Racer 2 was also released in around June 2002, seemingly simultaneously on PC, PS1 and PS2 this time round, with the PC version being compiled in May. This signified a change in the way that Davilex developed their titles, with the PC games essentially being parts of the PS2 versions of the games. Throughout London Racer 2, Audubon Rise 4 and Paris-Marseille Racing 2, Davilex struggled with doing the parts right. You know how I mentioned that the PC version of US Racer had a different menu to the PS2? Well, the PS2 menu has now been ported to the PC, and done so poorly. You see these black screens when I load the game or save settings? They are there because on the PS2, it's accessing the memory card. They decided not to remove this code entirely in the PC version for some reason. Plus, none of the PC games have car reflections, and the oddities don't stop there. The game once again has the files unpacked, but we can also see that London Racer 2 is internally called US Racer Alpha. Why is this based on the alpha build of US Racer? What? Or did they just simply forget to change the name? I don't really understand. And we have the debug logs still left in the game too, from when the developer last played the game, which is the same day that the build was compiled. Within the INI files we can turn off the blur cam. Yay! Funnily enough, the camera keys no longer work, the ones that the F1 screen shows. The different camera angles are handled by pressing C. The F1 screen that shows you your camera controls incidentally is also broken, like the developers forgot that they created it, which they probably did. There is a language INI file that shows a lot of cut content, such as a button to launch the London Racer website, like was the case on PC US Racer, but since the menu is a one-to-one version of the PS2 menu, this never made it in. We were supposed to be able to get more audio options, though these also didn't make it into the final game. Speaking of which, the PC versions of the radio stations have been encoded at a low sampling rate, and sometimes take a few seconds to start, which is very odd. There was also a reference to being able to change between imperial and metric, plus some other texts I have no idea what they mean. Interestingly enough, there is an internal log of when the radio switches between music only and the presenter talking, which I think was done in order for the characters in US Racer not to talk over the radio presenters. And finally, the PS2 language screen can be re-enabled on PC. In terms of the music and the maps, I adore this game purely because of the DJ. With funny script writing from David Morris and the Northern English presenter, it's a perfect combination of dumb and funny. A fun fact, while you will hear London and Edinburgh tracks in World Challenge, here they are untrimmed. In the middle of each radio segment is a commercial break, and afterwards we are back to the music and the funny callers. The commercials are great in themselves, with iconic phrases like, stewardess, is Uranus bigger than Mars? It's all a bit crude, but not in a bad way. Like the callers, such as Sinful Cindy. Or is it Simple Cindy? The guy that does a terrible Robert De Niro impression. And the guy with the Dumb and Dumber story. Honestly, I'm writing all of this from memory. With how iconic these characters and scripts are, give me a few more playthroughs of the game and I'll be able to read out the game script line by line from memory. The game was also sponsored by London's Kiss FM radio station, though I think other than the sponsorship, they had nothing to do with the game. Despite seeing references that this game has Kiss's best DJ. This bugged me and I had to get to the bottom of this. I noticed the name in the credits of Holiday Racer, and within the metadata to many of Davilex's games. This name was Mike Van Dam. He was very gracious and kind in responding to me very quickly, and shed a little insight into the company culture of Davilex. Sadly, my question will remain unanswered, since as it turns out, samples of voices were recorded all over Europe. My gut tells me that there was an intermediary firm that Davilex would contact, that would in turn ask voice actors in the database to record a few voice lines. This makes sense and is far more effective than bringing in tens of actors just to record a few lines for the radio or for the drivers. But this also means that Davilex did not know who were the people behind the voices. Mike also gave me some interesting ideas for future personal and channel plans, which I won't spoil because they're months if not years away from ever hitting the planning stage. But as cheesy as it always sounds from YouTubers, please do subscribe if you haven't already so you don't miss any future Davilex content. I will only briefly mention the maps since I've already spoke about them in part 1. But I did really appreciate being able to see these landmarks in the games first, then going over to London and Edinburgh and seeing them in person. In fact, I made 2 videos about this in the past. The roads are not at all realistic, with the original London Racer and even Team 6's Taxi Racer London 2 being more accurate, but it's still an amusing little diorama of UK's most iconic cities. That being said, the original London Racer had more location variety, driving around motorways, country roads and Oxford. And hey, thanks to the London Racer 2 PC part being such a rush job, we do get one leftover debug track, called Small One. Yep, it's just an oval track with no lighting. Still better than nothing. But yeah, otherwise, Audubon Rise 4 and Paris-Marseille Racing 2 are all pretty much the same games, with the maps and music changed. I'd love to talk about the final game for 2002, Knight Rider. I think I'll save looking at Knight Rider 1 and 2 in a separate future video, dedicated specifically to those games. What I will say, however, is that the language strings seen in London Racer 2 are finally used. None of the debug stuff works, including even changing the resolution. and the game files are unpacked again. So if you want a 3D model of Kit or of the Semi, knock yourselves out. In 2003, an educational book publisher Collins published a book titled Game Art, The Graphic Art of Computer Games. What blew my mind when I picked this up in my school library about 10 years ago was the inclusion of internal screenshots from Davilex games. As well as this, there are interviews from various artists at Davilex who explain the process. André van Rooyen, the art director who was with Davilex games from nearly the beginning up until the end, speaks about how Davilex did extensive photo shoots on location for textures and to capture the atmosphere of the city that they were in. He also mentions that Davilex had gone for a mass market appeal within their art direction for their games to not alienate the average player, which made sense 20 years ago, when gaming was not as ubiquitous as it is today. As he put it, the game needs to stand out but stick to the player's expectations. Rooyen also makes a point to predict the future, in the sense that the polygon count will be so high that people can't tell the difference between real life and video games, which kind of happened. Unreal Engine 5 essentially lets you have an infinite polygon count, but that's only one of the many things that make up a game. He also makes an interesting anecdote that indie studios will not be able to achieve these real worlds because they do not have the manpower to do so, which was certainly the case back then, but now with the advent of game engines that are easy to understand and free to develop on, it's easier than ever before for a small team to make AAA quality titles. The book also talks about the process of going to Universal to create the Knight Rider game. Plus there's a lot of screenshots from the development of Knight Rider, since I believe that was the most recent and most ambitious game at the time, though there are also screenshots from the development of Bikini Beach Stunt Racer, though I'm not sure if it had released at this point. The book also talks about the games not being street-to-street accurate, with Angelo Bod, the lead designer at Davilex Games, saying that the gameplay comes before accuracy, although I feel like you can do both to an extent. Yes, this history and trivia video was supposed to only span 2 videos, however I'm still awaiting to hear back from some people I've emailed, plus the length of this video once again is spiraling, so let's end things here for now. Thanks for watching and I hope to see you in part 3, where we take a look at the shift to media design group and the final games from Davilex.